She didn't know his name when she first stopped. She just knew he was old, cold, and always there, curled up on a piece of cardboard at the bus stop she passed every morning on her way to work. Most people walked faster when they saw him. Some crossed the street. Others pretended he didn't exist. But she stopped. Every day after that, she brought him breakfast, a paper bag, a warm drink, a few minutes of conversation before the city woke up. She never told anyone. She never filmed it. She never imagined it mattered. Until one morning, the bench was empty. No blanket, no cardboard, no old man. And 3 days later, at exactly 6:04 a.m., there was a knock at her door. Not police, not social workers, military officers, standing at attention, asking her questions about a man she thought the world had already forgotten. Before this story continues, I want to ask you something. If you've ever walked past someone and wondered what their life used to be like, if you've ever helped someone without expecting anything in return, or if you believe that kindness still matters in a world that moves too fast to notice people, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps this story reach the people who need to hear it most, and leave a comment, just one word, seen. Because this story is about what happens when someone finally is. Every morning at 5:42 a.m., the city felt unfinished. Streetlights still hummed, storefronts were dark. The air carried that quiet, in-between cold that didn't belong to night or day. That was when Aaliyah Brooks walked to the bus stop. Same route, same pace, same thoughts looping in her head about bills, schedules, and how little room there was for mistakes. The bus stop sat in front of a closed-down dry cleaner, its windows taped with yellowed notices no one bothered to read anymore. The bench was metal and cold, the glass shelters streaked with fingerprints and dust. Most mornings the place was empty, except for him. He slept on flattened cardboard pushed against the back wall, wrapped in a gray blanket that had once been thick but was now worn thin. His shoes were cracked at the seams. His beard was white and uneven, like it had given up trying to be neat a long time ago. A plastic bag with a few belongings, bottles, paper, something heavy that clinked, sat tucked near his shoulder like a guard dog. He never asked for anything. That was the part that unsettled people the most. Most unhoused men Aaliyah had seen held signs or muttered requests. This one didn't. He just existed in the space, eyes closed or staring straight ahead, as if he'd learned the safest way to survive was to be invisible. The first week Aaliyah noticed him, she did what everyone else did. She looked away. She checked her phone, adjusted her bag, stood farther down the sidewalk than necessary. It wasn't cruelty. It was survival. Her days were already full of things she couldn't fix. She worked long shifts for little pay, lived paycheck to paycheck, and measured her life in bus transfers and clock punches. She didn't have space for other people's problems. That's what she told herself. Still, every morning, her eyes found him anyway. One morning, a man in a suit walked past and kicked the edge of the cardboard by accident, or maybe on purpose. The old man startled awake, confusion flashing across his face before he pulled the blanket tighter, and said nothing. The man didn't apologize. No one stopped. Aaliyah felt something twist in her chest, sharp and uncomfortable. She hated that feeling. It slowed her down, made her late, made her think. She boarded the bus that morning with the image burned into her mind. The way the man had flinched, like he was used to being reminded he didn't belong. 2 mornings later, it rained. Cold, steady rain that soaked through jackets and shoes before sunrise. Aaliyah stood under the bus shelter, arms crossed, wishing she'd worn thicker socks. The old man was awake this time, hunched forward, trying to keep his blanket dry. Water dripped off the shelter roof and splashed onto the cardboard. For a moment, their eyes met, not long, not dramatic, just long enough for Aaliyah to see that his eyes were clear, not glassy, not focused, clear. He looked at her the way people look when they expect nothing. That look stayed with her the rest of the day. It followed her through her shift, through the break room, through the bus ride home, through the small apartment where the refrigerator hummed louder than it should because it was older than she was. That night, she stood in her kitchen holding a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter. She'd made herself a sandwich for work the next day, wrapped it carefully, set it by her bag. Then she stopped. She thought about the rain, the cardboard, the way he'd said nothing. She stared at the sandwich for a long time. Finally, she made another one. The next morning, her heart beat too fast as she approached the bus stop. She told herself she could turn around, pretend she forgot something, throw the sandwich away. He was awake again. She cleared her throat. Her voice felt smaller than usual. "Hey," she said. "I made too much." She held out the sandwich like it might disappear if she hesitated. The old man looked at it, then at her. He didn't reach for it right away. "You need that more than I do," he said quietly. She hadn't expected him to speak. "Maybe," Aaliyah replied, "but I'm offering." Another pause. Then he took it, carefully with both hands like it mattered. "Thank you," he said. "Truly." She nodded, already stepping back, embarrassed by how tight her throat felt. That should have been the end of it. One sandwich, one morning, nothing else. But the next day, she brought coffee in a thermos. The day after that, a banana. Then another sandwich. They didn't talk much at first. A few words. The weather, the bus running late. Small, safe topics. But Aaliyah noticed something strange. He always remembered. Which day it was. What she'd brought last time. What time the bus came. He never begged. Never complained. Never asked her for more. And slowly, without realizing when it happened, Aaliyah stopped thinking of him as the homeless man. He became the man at the bus stop. The one who waited. The one everyone else avoided. And the one who somehow had become part of her morning, like the streetlights, the cold air, and the quiet that came before the city remembered itself. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know his past. She didn't know that helping him would cost her more than she could afford, or that it would one day bring men in uniform to her door. All she knew was this: if she walked past him now, it would feel wrong, and that feeling was something she could no longer ignore. By the end of the first week, it stopped feeling like a decision. It became a routine. Aaliyah woke up 10 minutes earlier than she used to, not because she had to, because she wanted to. She moved quietly through her apartment, careful not to make noise even though she lived alone, as if the morning itself might break if she rushed it. 2 slices of bread, peanut butter, sometimes jelly, if she had it, a banana, if they were on sale. Coffee poured into the thermos she'd owned since college. She wrapped everything neatly, the same way she wrapped her own lunch. No special bag, no difference. By the time she reached the bus stop, the sky was still gray, the sun undecided about showing up. And every morning, he was there. Always awake now, always sitting upright when she arrived. Blanket folded across his legs, eyes following her down the sidewalk like he'd been listening for her steps. She noticed the details first. The way his hands shook slightly when he reached for the thermos. The way he waited until she sat down before taking the first sip. The way he always offered to split the sandwich. "Fair's fair," he said once, tearing it cleanly in half. She laughed then, soft and surprised, and shook her head. "I already ate." It was a lie, but one she told easily. They started talking more after that. Nothing heavy, nothing risky. He asked what she did for work. She told him she worked at a hospital. He nodded like that meant something important. "You help people," he said. She shrugged. "I clean up after them mostly." Still counts. She didn't know why that stayed with her all day. Some mornings he told stories, strange ones, about flying over places that didn't look like cities from the sky, about long nights where sleep wasn't allowed, about people who shook his hand once and never remembered his name again. "I used to wear a uniform," he said one morning, staring past the street like he was watching something move only he could see. Aaliyah smiled politely. She didn't correct him. She didn't question it. She'd grown up around people who carried their own versions of the past. Some were true, some were softened, some were stitched together to make the present bearable. She figured his stories were the same. Still, there were things that didn't quite add up. He never confused dates, never mixed up details, never repeated the same story twice. And sometimes, just sometimes, his voice changed when he spoke about certain things. Straighter, sharper, like a man used to being listened to. One morning, as she stood to catch her bus, he said, "You don't have to do this, you know." She froze. "Do what?" "Come every day." She looked at him, really looked at him. "I know," she said, "but I want to." He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded once. "Be careful with that," he said quietly. "With what?" "Wanting." The bus pulled up before she could ask what he meant. By the second week, other people noticed. A woman waiting for the bus stared, openly. A man shook his head as he walked past. Someone muttered, "She's encouraging it." Aaliyah pretended not to hear, but the looks followed her onto the bus, into work, back home. One afternoon, her supervisor pulled her aside. "You've been late twice this week." "I know," Aaliyah said quickly. "It won't happen again." Her supervisor nodded, unconvinced. "Just be careful. People notice patterns." That night, Aaliyah sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her bank app. The numbers didn't look good. They never did. Rent was due in 10 days. Her phone bill was already late. She thought about the thermos, the groceries, the extra bus she sometimes missed because she stayed a few minutes longer. She told herself she could stop. She told herself she should. The next morning, she brought breakfast anyway. That morning was colder than the others. The wind cut through the bus shelter like it was personal. The old man's blanket wasn't enough. She could see it, in the way his shoulders tensed, the way his hands curled inward. She knelt down without thinking and tucked the blanket tighter around his legs. He stiffened, then relaxed. No one said anything. A man across the street watched, frowning. Aaliyah felt it, felt the judgment, the silent question. Why him? She didn't have an answer. All she knew was that when she knelt there, the world felt quieter, smaller. Like for a few minutes, it made sense. "You're going to freeze," she said, handing him the thermos. He smiled faintly. "I've been colder." She believed him. As the days passed, the routine became the most stable thing in her life. The bus stop, the breakfast, the few minutes where she wasn't rushing or pretending. She didn't know it yet, but this was the calm before the fracture, the last stretch of normal before something broke. Because routines feel safest right before they disappear. And one morning, without warning, the man at the bus stop would be gone. No blanket, no cardboard, no quiet voice waiting for her steps. Just an empty bench. In a silence that felt too loud to ignore, the bench was empty. Aaliyah noticed it before she reached the bus stop. Something felt wrong in her chest, a quiet pressure that made her slow down without knowing why. She scanned the sidewalk automatically, left, right, behind the glass shelter, expecting to see the familiar shape of the blanket, the cardboard, the plastic bag tucked near the wall. Nothing. She stopped walking. For a second, she told herself she was early. Maybe he'd stepped away. Maybe someone had woken him and told him to move along. It happened all the time. People like him didn't get to stay in one place for long. She stepped under the shelter and set her bag down. The cardboard was gone. Not folded. Not pushed aside. Gone. Even the faint outline where it usually lay, darkened by months of use, had faded, like the space had already decided to forget him. Aaliyah stood there, longer than she meant to, eyes moving back and forth as if he might appear if she looked hard enough. She checked the street, the alley behind the building, the corner where the trash can sat. Still nothing. The bus came. She didn't get on. The doors opened and closed. The driver glanced at her, then pulled away. Aaliyah barely noticed. Her fingers tightened around the thermos in her hand. It felt heavier than usual. He probably just moved, she told herself. She'd heard that before. Said it before. It was the kind of explanation people used when they didn't want to think too hard about where someone had gone. The second bus came. She boarded that one. All through the ride, she stared at the window, watching the city wake up. People spilled onto sidewalks. Coffee shops opened. Life continued like it always did, unbothered, efficient, indifferent. At work, she was distracted. She cleaned the same counter twice, missed a call from her supervisor. When someone asked if she was okay, she nodded too quickly. Yes, she said, just tired. That evening, on her way home, she got off one stop early. She walked back to the bus shelter. Still empty. No blanket. No bag. No sign he'd ever been there. Aaliyah stood under the shelter until the streetlights flickered on. The glass reflected her face back at her. Tired, confused, unsettled. She went home with the thermos still full. The next morning, she brought breakfast again. She didn't know why. Habit, maybe. Hope. Or fear of what it would mean if she didn't. She arrived earlier than usual, breath visible in the cold air. Empty. She waded through one bus, then another. Her chest tightened with something that felt dangerously close to panic. People move, she reminded herself. They don't disappear. But by the third morning, the truth settled in, heavy and unwelcome. He wasn't coming back. Aaliyah started looking. She checked the nearby streets on her walk to work, scanning doorways and alleys. She asked the woman who ran the coffee cart if she'd seen an older man sleeping near the bus stop. The woman shook her head. Not lately. She stopped by a shelter after her shift, the kind with fluorescent lights and long intake lines. She waited nearly an hour just to speak to someone at the desk. Do you know an older man? Aaliyah asked carefully. White beard, kinda quiet, usually sleeps near the bus stop on Mercer. The woman barely looked up. Name? I don't know. A pause. A sigh. Then I can't help you. Aaliyah tried again at a clinic, then another shelter, then a hospital phone line that transferred her 3 times before politely telling her they couldn't share patient information. Each answer felt like a door closing. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Her mind replayed small moments she hadn't thought mattered. The way he'd said, "Be careful with wanting." The way he'd looked at her like he was memorizing her face. The way he'd never asked for anything. On the 4th morning, she brought a note. She folded it carefully and slid it into the paper bag with the sandwich. I hope you're okay, it read. I'll be here. She placed the bag where he usually slept, tucking it against the wall so it wouldn't blow away. Leaving it there felt ridiculous, like leaving food for a ghost. As she stepped back, she noticed people watching. A man waiting for the bus frowned openly. A woman glanced at the bag, then at Aaliyah, then looked away. She felt foolish, exposed, but she left it anyway. That afternoon, she checked the bus stop again. The bag was gone. Her heart jumped, then sank. The bag wasn't crumpled or empty. It was gone entirely. No trace, no crumbs, no note. Someone else could have taken it, or he could have. She stood there longer than she should have, hope and fear wrestling inside her chest. That night, she dreamed of the bus stop. In the dream, she was standing under the shelter, calling out, her voice echoing off the glass. The bench was there, the cardboard was there, but every time she reached for him, he faded like smoke. She woke up with her heart racing. 2 more days passed. No sign of him. On the 7th morning, she almost didn't go. She stood in her kitchen, staring at the bread, the peanut butter, the thermos. Her body felt heavy, like it was resisting the routine it had learned. If I don't go, she thought, I won't have to face it. But she went anyway. She walked slower than usual, bracing herself for the emptiness. And then she saw him. He was sitting on the cardboard like he'd never left, thinner, paler. His blanket pulled tight around his shoulders. For a moment, she thought she was imagining him. Then he looked up. Their eyes met. Aaliyah didn't think. She dropped her bag and ran. "Where were you?" she blurted out, breathless, crouching in front of him. He smiled faintly, tired, fragile. "Had some things to take care of," he said. "You disappeared," she said, anger and relief tangled together. I know." Something in his voice stopped her. He reached into his coat pocket slowly, like the movement cost him effort. His hand trembled as he pulled something out. A white envelope, slightly worn, carefully sealed. He held it out to her. "If something happens to me," he said quietly, "I need you to send this." Aaliyah stared at the envelope. "What do you mean?" "Just promise me," he said, "but please." The bus pulled up behind her. People stepped off, stepped around them. The world kept moving. Aaliyah took the envelope. "I promise," she said. He nodded, closing his eyes like that was all he needed. She didn't know it yet, but that envelope was already changing everything. Aaliyah didn't open the envelope. Not that day, not the next. She slipped it into her bag and told herself she'd think about it later, when things were quieter, when her chest didn't feel so tight every time she remembered the way his hand had shaken as he passed it to her. The routine returned, but it wasn't the same. He was weaker now. She saw it immediately. His movements were slower, more deliberate, like each one required negotiation with his body. He smiled less. When he did, it felt practiced. "You okay?" she asked one morning, trying to sound casual. "I'm upright," he said. "That's something." She didn't laugh this time. She started bringing more. An extra banana, a protein bar she couldn't really afford. Once she wrapped her own sandwich in half and gave it to him without mentioning it. He noticed anyway. "You're losing weight," he said. "I've always been small." He studied her face like he was reading between lines she hadn't spoken. Then he nodded, letting it go, but not forgetting. The city, meanwhile, stayed the same. People hurried past, cars honked. The bus arrived late, mortit, often than not. No one asked where the old man had gone. No one commented when he came back thinner, quieter, more fragile. Invisibility, Aaliyah realized, didn't break when someone disappeared. It simply stretched. The morning it happened, the air was heavy and damp, the kind that pressed against her skin. Aaliyah arrived at the bus stop earlier than usual, juggling the thermos and bag. He was already awake, sitting straighter than he had in days. For a moment, relief washed over her. Maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe he was getting better. She knelt and handed him the thermos. "Careful," she said. "It's hot." He took it, and then his hand jerked violently. The thermos slipped from his grip and hit the concrete, clattering loudly. Coffee spilled across the sidewalk, dark and steaming. He stared at his hand like it didn't belong to him. Then his face changed. Color drained from it in seconds. His mouth opened, but the words came out wrong, slurred, tangled. Aaliyah felt a flash of pure fear. "Hey," she said sharply. "Hey, look at me." He tried to respond. His body swayed, and then he collapsed. Time fractured. Aaliyah dropped to her knees, catching his shoulders before his head hit the ground. His body was heavier than she expected, dead weight pulling against her arms. "Someone call 911, she shouted, her voice breaking through the quiet morning. A woman across the street froze, then fumbled for her phone. A man jogging slowed, looked, then kept going. Aaliyah lowered him onto his side the way she'd seen nurses do at work. His breathing was shallow, uneven. His lips had gone pale. "Stay with me," she whispered, hands shaking as she tried to keep him still. "Come on, stay with me." He made a sound, half breath, half word, but his eyes rolled back. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes later. It felt like hours. The paramedics moved fast, voices clipped and professional. They asked questions Aaliyah answered without thinking. How old is he? I don't know. Any medical history? I don't know. Are you family? The question hit harder than it should have. I'm all he has, she said. They didn't argue. At the hospital, everything became noise and motion. Doors swinging open, wheels rattling, voices calling out numbers and codes. Aaliyah followed until a nurse gently stopped her and guided her into a waiting area. She sat down hard, realizing she was still clutching the empty thermos. Her phone buzzed. Work. Missed calls. A message from her supervisor. She didn't answer. An hour passed, then another. Finally, a nurse called her name. You're here for George Fletcher? The name startled her. Yes, she said quickly. Is he okay? He's stable, the nurse said. But he's severely dehydrated, possible stroke. We're running tests. Relief crashed into fear. But, the nurse continued, her tone shifting, we have a problem. Aaliyah's stomach dropped. He doesn't have ID, no insurance, no emergency contact. We may need to transfer him to county care. Aaliyah shook her head immediately. No, you can't. It's policy. He's a veteran, Aaliyah said, the words tumbling out before she'd fully thought them through. Check the VA system. The nurse hesitated. Do you have proof of that? Aaliyah thought of the envelope. Still sealed. Still untouched. I don't, she admitted. But please, just check. A doctor nearby paused, listening. He stepped forward, scanning the screen. Run the name, he said quietly. The nurse frowned, but typed. Seconds passed. Then the screen changed. Her expression shifted. She leaned closer, eyes narrowing as she read. There's a match, she said slowly. Service record, heavily redacted. The doctor's brows lifted. What does that mean? Aaliyah asked, her voice barely steady. It means, the nurse said, looking at her, differently now. His service was classified. The room felt suddenly too small. The stories, the precision, the way he spoke, they weren't stories. The doctor straightened. We'll keep him here. I'll handle the authorization. Aaliyah exhaled shakily, her knees weak with relief. When they finally let her see him, he looked smaller in the hospital bed, wires and tubes attached to a body that had endured more than she'd known. His eyes fluttered open when she sat beside him. You didn't have to, he whispered. Yes, she said softly. I did. He reached for her hand, his grip weak but intentional. You kept your promise, he murmured. Aaliyah swallowed hard. She didn't know yet that this was only the beginning, that the envelope in her bag, and the truth now waking up in hospital records, would soon pull her into a world far bigger than a bus stop. But as she sat there, holding his hand, one thing became painfully clear. The man everyone avoided was never meant to be forgotten, and the system that erased him was about to be forced to remember. Aaliyah went home that night, with the envelope still buried in her bag. It pressed against her side as she walked, a constant reminder of something unfinished. She could feel it even through the fabric, like it had weight beyond paper. Every step away from the hospital made her chest tighten, as if she were leaving part of herself behind in that white room filled with quiet machines and steady beeps. At home, she dropped her bag by the door and stood there for a long time without turning on the lights. The apartment felt smaller than usual, too quiet. She finally switched on the lamp and sat at the small table by the window. The envelope slid out of her bag and landed in front of her, white, unmarked except for an address written in careful, slanted handwriting. Her name wasn't on it. That alone made her hands shake. She thought about everything she'd learned that day, how the man she'd assumed was just another forgotten face had a record buried behind redactions and silence. How people in authority had suddenly paid attention once the word classified appeared on a screen. She turned the envelope over, still sealed. He asked you to mail it, she reminded herself, not read it. But curiosity pressed in hard, fear too. What if it was something dangerous, something that explained why he'd disappeared before, why he'd looked over his shoulder even when no one was there? Aaliyah pushed the envelope away. Not tonight. The next morning, she went straight to the hospital after work. He was awake when she arrived, propped up against pillows, color slowly returning to his face. He smiled when he saw her, and the relief in his eyes hit her harder than anything the doctors had said. "You're still here," he said. "Where else would I be?" He chuckled weakly, then winced. "Guess I didn't scare you off." "Not even close." They sat in comfortable silence, for a moment, the kind that didn't demand words. "You didn't open it," he said finally. She looked up. "How did you know?" He smiled. "You'd be different if you had." Aaliyah reached into her bag and placed the envelope gently on the tray table beside him. "I didn't know if I should." "You shouldn't," he said. "Not unless you have to." She studied his face. "Have to for what?" "For when I can't explain things myself." The words settled heavy between them. "You're not going anywhere," she said firmly. He didn't argue. Instead, he reached for the envelope, turning it slowly in his fingers. "I spent most of my life believing that if you stayed quiet long enough, the world would leave you alone." His voice was steady now, clearer than she'd ever heard it. "I was wrong." Aaliyah leaned forward. "What do you mean?" He looked at her, really looked at her. "Some stories don't stay buried. They wait." The doctors discharged him 3 days later, transferring him to a VA facility across town. It wasn't close, 2 buses and a walk, but it was clean, staffed, warm. The first time Aaliyah visited, he was sitting by a window, sunlight cutting across his face. He looked more like himself there, whoever that truly was. "I've been thinking," he said as she sat down, "about all those mornings." She smiled softly. "Me too." "You never asked me who I was." "I didn't need to." He nodded, as if that answer mattered more than she knew. "Most people only care once they think your past makes you valuable." She didn't disagree. On her 3rd visit, he handed her something else. A small notebook, worn leather cover, pages filled with tight, deliberate handwriting. "Just in case," he said. "This explains things better than I ever could out loud." She flipped through it carefully. Names, dates, places. Some pages made sense. Others looked like fragments of a language she didn't speak. "What am I supposed to do with this?" "Hold on to it," he said. "And remember." "Remember what?" "That small things aren't small." Aaliyah laughed quietly, then felt tears prick her eyes. "You're not very good at being subtle." He smiled. "Never was." That night, at home, she placed the notebook and the envelope side by side on her table. 2 pieces of a story she still didn't fully understand. She didn't know yet that she was running out of time. That some promises are only tested when it's already too late. And that soon, very soon, she would have to decide whether to stay quiet like the world wanted, or send a letter that would make powerful people uncomfortable. The envelope waited, and so did everything it carried. The phone rang at 6:02 a.m. Aaliyah was standing in her kitchen, half asleep, waiting for the coffee to finish brewing. The sound cut through the quiet, like something sharp, out of place. She frowned at the screen. The number was unfamiliar. She almost let it go to voicemail. Something made her answer. "Hello?" There was a pause on the other end, just long enough for her stomach to tighten. "Miss Brooks," a man said finally. His voice was calm, practiced. "This is Pine Valley VA Care Center. I'm calling about Mr. Fletcher." The room seemed to tilt. "Yes," Aaliyah said, gripping the counter. "Is he okay?" Another pause, longer this time. "I'm very sorry to tell you this." the man said gently. He passed away in his sleep early this morning. Heart failure. It was peaceful. The words didn't land all at once. They drifted, disconnected, like they belonged to someone else's life. Passed away. Peaceful. Aaliyah stared at the coffee pot, watching steam rise like nothing in the world had changed. Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat. Are you sure? Yes, ma'am. Silence stretched between them. There's no listed family, the man continued. We were told you were the closest contact. We'll need you to come in to collect his personal belongings and discuss arrangements. Arrangements. For a man who'd slept on cardboard weeks ago. I'll be there, she said quietly. She hung up and slid down the cabinet until she was sitting on the kitchen floor. The cold tile pressed through her clothes, grounding her in a way nothing else could. George was gone. The man who'd shared his sandwich, who'd warned her about wanting, who'd trusted her with his words and his silence. Gone. She didn't cry, not yet. The grief felt too big, too solid, like a weight sitting directly on her chest. At the VA center, they handed her a small plastic bag. Inside, a folded blanket, worn shoes, 3 shirts, the notebook, and the envelope, still sealed. Seeing it again made her chest ache. He didn't have much, the nurse said softly, like she was apologizing for the world. He had enough, Aaliyah replied, before she could stop herself. At home, she sat at the table for a long time before touching anything. The apartment felt different now, quieter, emptier. Finally, she picked up the envelope. This time, her fingers didn't hesitate. She opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, written in the same steady handwriting she had come to recognize, and beneath it, a photograph. Her breath caught. The photo showed George decades younger, standing straight in a formal military uniform. Medals lined his chest. On either side of him stood men in suits, faces stern, important. She flipped it over. 3 words were written on the back. Remember the girl. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the letter. It wasn't long. He wrote about service, about being forgotten, about how systems fail quietly without apology, and then about her. She brought me breakfast every day, he wrote, not because she thought I was someone important, but because she thought I was someone. Aaliyah pressed the paper to her chest, the first tear finally slipping free. At the bottom of the letter was an address, Pentagon, Office of the Inspector General. She understood then why he'd been afraid, why he'd waited, why he'd chosen her. Mailing that letter would change things, maybe ruin things, maybe drag her into a world she didn't belong in. She could throw it away. No one would ever know. The world would stay quiet. Aaliyah stood, grabbed her jacket, and headed for the door. At the post office, she stood in line, holding the envelope like it might burn her. When her turn came, she slid it across the counter. I need to send this, she said. The clerk waited. That'll be $5.60. Aaliyah paid with crumpled bills. She watched the clerk stamp it and drop it into a bin with hundreds of other letters. Just paper among paper. Walking outside, the morning air felt sharper, cleaner. She didn't feel brave. She felt terrified, because somewhere far away, someone powerful was about to read a letter that ended with one simple request: remember the girl. And when they did, nothing would be quiet again. 2 weeks passed. Life tried to return to normal, the way it always does after something breaks. Aaliyah went back to work. She caught the same bus. She stood at the same stop every morning, even though she didn't need to anymore. The bench stayed empty. Someone else slept there once or twice, a younger man, bundled in a hoodie, eyes wary, but it wasn't the same. Aaliyah didn't stop. Not yet. Her chest still felt too tight, like kindness itself needed time to heal. She told herself the letter was gone now, filed, forgotten. Just another piece of paper swallowed by a system built to absorb guilt without reacting. That thought helped her sleep. Until the knock. It came at 6:11 a.m. Not hurried, not aggressive, precise. 3 firm knocks, evenly spaced. Aaliyah froze in the middle of pulling on her jacket. For a split second, she thought she'd imagined it. Then it came again, exactly the same rhythm. Her heart began to race. She wasn't expecting anyone. No one ever came to her apartment that early. She glanced at the peephole and felt the breath leave her lungs. 2 men and 1 woman stood in the hallway. All 3 wore military dress uniforms. Their shoes were polished. Their posture was perfect. Their expressions were calm, but serious in a way that made her stomach drop. She opened the door slowly. "Yes?" Her voice sounded smaller than she wanted. The man in the center stepped forward. He looked to be in his 50s, hair graying at the temples, his uniform marked with insignia she didn't recognize but instinctively understood carried weight. "Miss Aaliyah Brooks," he said. "Yes." "I'm Colonel Hayes," he said. "These are Officers Martinez and Carter. We're here regarding George Fletcher." The hallway seemed to narrow. Aaliyah swallowed. "Is something wrong?" The colonel studied her for a moment, as if deciding how much truth she could handle at once. "No, ma'am," he said finally. "What's wrong already happened." Her hands trembled at her sides. "Then why are you here?" He took a breath. "Because of a letter you sent." The room tilted. "I didn't do anything illegal," she said quickly. You did exactly what Mr. Fletcher asked," the colonel interrupted gently. "And exactly what many people before you failed to do." Silence stretched. Colonel Hayes reached into his folder and pulled out a photograph. The same one. George in uniform. Medals. Power frozen in time. "You knew him as a homeless man," the colonel continued. "We knew him as something else entirely." Aaliyah's throat went dry. "Mr. Fletcher was a senior intelligence operative," Hayes said. "Highly classified, decorated, essential, and forgotten." Officer Martinez shifted slightly behind him, jaw tight. "The letter you mailed reached the Inspector General," Hayes went on. "She read it personally." Aaliyah barely whispered. "Why?" Hayes met her eyes. "Because Mr. Fletcher didn't write it for himself." He paused. "He wrote it for you." Aaliyah felt something crack open inside her. The colonel straightened. "General Ashford has requested to meet you." "Meet me?" The words felt unreal. "I'm nobody," Aaliyah said automatically. "I just brought him food." "That," Hayes said firmly, "is exactly why she wants to see you." He handed her a sealed envelope. This one heavy, official. Inside were flight details, a hotel reservation, a formal invitation, Pentagon letterhead. "We'll handle the logistics," Hayes said. "Transportation, time off work, everything." Aaliyah stared at the envelope. "I don't understand what you expect from me." Hayes' expression softened just slightly. "Honesty," he said, "and courage." The officers turned to leave. As they stepped away, Officer Carter paused and looked back at her. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "he talked about you, even when it hurt to talk at all." The door closed. Aaliyah stood alone in her apartment, heart pounding, the weight of something enormous settling onto her shoulders. She looked down at the empty bench outside her window. George had been right. Some stories don't stay buried. They wait. And now, hers was about to be told. Aaliyah had never been on a plane before. She pressed her forehead lightly against the window as the city shrank beneath her, streets folding into neat lines, problems suddenly looking small from above. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers twisted together, the invitation from the Pentagon folded carefully in her bag, like it might disappear if she checked too often. Across the aisle, Colonel Hayes sat quietly reviewing documents. He hadn't said much since they'd boarded. When he did speak, it was brief, factual, no reassurances, no dramatic build-up. That scared her more than anything. They landed in Washington just after noon. Everything moved quickly after that. A car waiting at the gate, a clean hotel room with crisp white sheets and a view of buildings she'd only seen on television. She stood in the shower longer than necessary that night, letting the water run over her shoulders, trying to calm the hum of anxiety beneath her skin. The next morning, she followed Colonel Hayes through long corridors, lined with flags and framed photographs. People passed them with purpose, voices low, steps confident. No one looked twice at her, but Aaliyah felt exposed anyway, like she was wearing the wrong costume in someone else's story. They stopped outside a plain door. Hayes knocked once. "Come in," a woman's voice called. The office was smaller than Aaliyah expected. No grand desk, no dramatic lighting, just bookshelves, a few framed commendations, and a woman standing near the window, hands clasped behind her back. She turned as they entered, General Victoria Ashford. Her uniform was immaculate, her silver hair pulled back neatly, her eyes sharp, measuring but not unkind. "Miss Brooks," she said, stepping forward, "thank you for coming." Aaliyah shook her hand. The grip was firm, steady. "Please," Ashford said, gesturing to a chair. "Sit." Aaliyah did, heart pounding. Ashford returned to her desk and opened a thick file. Aaliyah recognized George's name on the tab immediately. "I received Mr. Fletcher's letter 3 weeks ago," Ashford began. It was the first confirmation we'd had in over a decade that he was alive. She paused, then added quietly, "and then that he had died." Aaliyah swallowed hard. "He served this country for 23 years, Ashford continued. "Classified operations, missions that don't officially exist. He saved lives, some of them belonging to people who still make decisions in this building." She looked up. "And when he retired, the system failed him." "How?" Aaliyah asked, her voice barely steady. Ashford closed the file. Paperwork, redacted records, a mental health evaluation that got delayed. By the time anyone noticed, he was gone. Gone. Sleeping at a bus stop. Ashford leaned forward. "We didn't lose him in combat. We lost him in silence." The words settled heavy. "Why am I here?" Aaliyah asked finally. Ashford studied her for a moment. "Because George Fletcher didn't write his letter to accuse us. He wrote it to remind us." She slid the photograph across the desk. "He wanted us to remember the girl who treated him like a person when the institution treated him like a problem." Aaliyah's chest tightened. "I just brought him breakfast," she said softly. "And that," Ashford replied, "is precisely the point." She stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city. "We're opening a full review. Veterans with classified records, tracking failures, benefits delays." She turned back. "But policy changes don't move without pressure, without human cost." Aaliyah's heart raced. "What are you asking me to do?" Ashford didn't hesitate. "I want you to tell your story," she said, publicly. The word echoed. "Testify," Ashford added, "before the Senate Armed Services Committee." Aaliyah felt the room spin. "I'm not qualified," she said quickly. "I don't understand politics, or law, or—" "You understand kindness," Ashford interrupted calmly. "And what happens when systems forget people?" She held Aaliyah's gaze. "That's enough." Silence filled the room. Aaliyah thought of the bus stop, the thermos, the envelope in her bag weeks ago. She took a slow breath. "If I do this," she said, "I won't clean it up. I won't pretend this wasn't ugly." Ashford's mouth curved into the faintest smile. "Good. The truth usually is." Aaliyah nodded. "Yes," she said, I'll do it." As they stood to leave, Ashford spoke again. "Miss Brooks." Aaliyah turned. "You kept your promise," the general said. "Now we intend to keep ours." Walking back into the hallway, Aaliyah felt the weight of it all settle fully onto her shoulders. She had come to Washington thinking she was nobody. She was leaving with a story powerful enough to make people uncomfortable. And for the first time, she understood exactly why George had chosen her. The hearing room was larger than Aaliyah expected. Tiered rows of seats curved upward like an arena. Microphones dotted the long table at the front, each one waiting. Cameras lined the back wall, quiet now, but already hungry. Senators filtered in slowly, shaking hands, murmuring to one another as if this were just another morning on the schedule. For Aaliyah, it felt like standing at the edge of something irreversible. She sat at the witness table, hands folded tightly in her lap. The suit general. Ashford's team had provided fit well, but it didn't feel like hers. It felt borrowed, like everything else in this building. She thought about the bus stop, how small it was, how quiet, how real. A clerk called the room to order. Voices settled. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. General Ashford spoke first. Her voice was calm, precise, practiced. She laid out George Fletcher's service record without embellishment, classified missions, decades of duty, medals that had never been displayed. She explained how the system failed him, how he disappeared into redacted files and unanswered paperwork. "We did not lose him overseas," Ashford said. "We lost him here." Murmurs rippled through the room. Then it was Aaliyah's turn. She stood slowly, legs unsteady. A staffer adjusted the microphone in front of her. The sound echoed louder than it should have. She took a breath. "My name is Aaliyah Brooks," she began. "I didn't know George Fletcher was a veteran when I met him." A pause. "I knew him as the man who slept at my bus stop." The room went still. "I brought him breakfast every morning for 6 months," she continued. "A sandwich, coffee, nothing special. I never asked him who he used to be." She looked up, meeting the eyes of the people watching her. "Because it didn't matter." One senator leaned forward. "Why didn't it matter?" "Because he was already a person," Aaliyah replied. Her voice steadied as she spoke. "He didn't need a uniform or medals for me to treat him with dignity." The senator nodded slowly. Another voice cut in, sharper. "Miss Brooks, are you suggesting that the system should prioritize every homeless individual in this country?" Aaliyah swallowed. She had practiced for this. Still, the question landed heavy. "I'm suggesting," she said carefully, "that when someone gives their life to serve this country, we don't get to forget them just because their file is inconvenient." Silence. She continued before fear could stop her. "George didn't disappear because he failed. He disappeared because the system stopped looking." A senator glanced down at his notes. "What changed?" Aaliyah's chest tightened. "I changed," she said, "because I stopped walking past him." The words felt simple, almost too simple. "But when he collapsed," she went on, "when he was dying on a sidewalk, the system still didn't see him. Not until a record came up marked classified." Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't stop. "That's when everything mattered. His past, his rank, his value." She shook her head. "But it mattered before that. It mattered every morning he woke up cold and hungry and invisible." The room was silent now. Even the cameras seemed to wait. A senator cleared his throat. "What do you want from us, Miss Brooks?" Aaliyah thought of George's handwriting. "Remember the girl?" "I want accountability," she said. "I want systems that don't require kindness from strangers just to work. And I want us to remember that people don't become worthy when we discover who they used to be." She stepped back from the microphone, hands shaking. When she sat down, she didn't know if she'd said too much or not enough. The hearing adjourned an hour later. Outside, reporters swarmed. Questions flew. Cameras flashed. Someone asked how it felt to change policy. Aaliyah shook her head. "I didn't change anything," she said quietly. "I just told the truth." That evening, she stood alone at the Lincoln Memorial, looking out over the reflecting pool. The city lights shimmered on the water, distant and untouchable. Her phone buzzed. A message from General Ashford. "They've approved the fund, $5 million to start. It will be named after him." Aaliyah closed her eyes. The George Fletcher Memorial Fund. She imagined the bus stop again. The cardboard, the thermos, the man everyone avoided. She took a slow breath. George had been right. Small things weren't small. They were just the beginning. And as Aaliyah turned away from the water, heading back into the city, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She hadn't spoken for him that day. She had spoken because of him. And the world had finally listened.